July 1941. Washington, D.C. William Joseph Donovan walked into the Oval Office and told President Franklin Roosevelt something that no one else in his administration was saying at that moment with the same clarity and the same conviction. America had no intelligence service. It was going to need one. Roosevelt already knew this. The intelligence gaps that had allowed Pearl Harbor to be planned, though Pearl Harbor had not yet happened in July 1941, were in some form apparent to every senior official who had looked honestly at the American government's ability to collect and analyze information about foreign powers. The State Department gathered diplomatic reports. The Army had its G2 intelligence sections. The Navy had its intelligence arm. But none of these organizations had the specific mission that Donovan was describing: the systematic collection of all-source intelligence, the coordination of that intelligence into strategic assessments, and the conduct of the covert operations that a nation at war needed if it was going to fight effectively in the specific ways that the Second World War was going to require. America had no equivalent of Britain's MI6, no equivalent of Germany's Abwehr, no equivalent of any of the intelligence services that the other major powers had been building and operating for decades. The reasons for this were partly constitutional. A country that had not traditionally fought wars on foreign soil had not developed the foreign intelligence capability that foreign operations required, and partly cultural. A country that celebrated openness and transparency had not made peace with the institutional secrecy that intelligence services required. Donovan was the man who was going to build what America needed, and the argument he made to Roosevelt in July 1941 was the argument that eventually produced the Office of Strategic Services. William Joseph Donovan was born in Buffalo, New York, in 1883, the son of Irish immigrants who had given him the specific combination of ambition and toughness that immigrant families in the late 19th century produced in their children, who understood that the American opportunity their parents had crossed an ocean for was not automatic and had to be claimed by individual effort. He had excelled at Columbia Law School, had built a successful law practice in Buffalo, and had served in the First World War in a way that produced one of the most decorated combat records in American military history. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in 1918, where he had commanded his battalion under conditions that the citation described with the specific language of extraordinary valor, leading his men through fire that had stopped other units, continuing to command while wounded, doing the specific things that the Medal of Honor was designed to recognize. He was known as Wild Bill from the First World War, a nickname that captured both his personal courage and his specific approach to command, which prioritized aggressive action over defensive caution in the specific circumstances where those two approaches pointed in different directions. He had spent the interwar years building his law practice, which became one of the most prominent in New York, while maintaining an involvement in public affairs and foreign policy that reflected the specific combination of intelligence and ambition that the First World War had not exhausted. He had traveled extensively, had met with foreign leaders and military officers, and had developed an understanding of European political and military dynamics that few Americans outside the State Department and the major universities possessed. Roosevelt had used Donovan in the years before America's formal entry into the war as an informal personal emissary, sending him to Europe and to Britain to assess the military situation and to build the relationships with British intelligence officials that would eventually become critical when America entered the war. The British had been operating their intelligence services for decades and had, by 1941, built a specific understanding of what intelligence services required in terms of personnel, training, organization, and integration with military and political decision-making that Donovan found invaluable during his visits. The British were also, with specific deliberateness, cultivating Donovan's interest in creating an American intelligence service because they understood that an American intelligence partner who could share information and coordinate operations would be far more valuable than an American military partner who was operating in intelligence darkness. The Coordinator of Information Office that Roosevelt established in July 1941 based on Donovan's recommendations was the embryo of what would become the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was formally established in June 1942 with Donovan as its director, charged with the collection and analysis of intelligence and the conduct of special operations in coordination with the military departments. What Donovan built in the OSS was unlike anything the American government had previously attempted: a combination of intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, psychological warfare, sabotage, and support for resistance movements that attempted to do simultaneously everything that the separate intelligence and special operations services of other countries had taken decades to develop. He recruited from universities, from law firms, from business, from the arts, from anywhere he could find the specific combination of intelligence and adaptability and willingness to operate in dangerous and ambiguous circumstances that the OSS required. The Office of Strategic Services became known informally as OSO Social for the proportion of its personnel who came from the social elite of the American establishment, Ivy League graduates and their connections, though the actual personnel were far more diverse than the nickname suggested. The OSS operations that followed were conducted in every theater of the war, with varying degrees of effectiveness and with the specific combination of improvisation and eventual competence that an organization building its capabilities as it was fighting always produces. In Europe, OSS agents operated behind German lines, gathering intelligence that was transmitted to London and Washington, organizing resistance movements in occupied countries, conducting sabotage operations against German infrastructure, and supporting the special operations that the Allied military campaign required. In the Pacific, OSS detachments worked with nationalist Chinese forces and with the resistance movements in occupied territories, conducting intelligence collection and guerrilla support operations that the vast geography and the specific political complexities of the Pacific theater made extraordinarily difficult. In Burma, the OSS Detachment 101 under Colonel William Pearse built and led an indigenous guerrilla force from the Kachin people that grew to approximately 10,000 fighters and that conducted sustained operations against Japanese forces throughout the Burma campaign, killing an estimated 5,500 Japanese soldiers and capturing significant intelligence, at a cost of approximately 22 American OSS officers and enlisted men killed. Detachment 101 was one of the most effective guerrilla operations in the history of American intelligence, a demonstration that the OSS model of combining American leadership and training with indigenous fighters who knew the terrain could produce operational results that conventional military forces of far larger size could not replicate. The OSS also made significant contributions to the intelligence assessment of German nuclear weapons development, to the organization of resistance networks in France that supported the D-Day landings, and to the interrogation and handling of captured German intelligence personnel who provided information that shaped Allied military planning. The quality of the OSS's intelligence analysis, which Donovan had built around the academics and research professionals who had joined the organization from the major universities, was in the assessment of subsequent intelligence historians the most significant institutional contribution of the OSS to American intelligence capability, more significant even than the operational activities that the organization was best known for. The research and analysis branch of the OSS, which employed hundreds of academics, produced assessments of German and Japanese capabilities that were, in the judgment of those who had access to both the OSS analysis and the subsequent declassified military records, among the most accurate strategic intelligence assessments produced by any government during the war. The OSS was dissolved in September 1945, 2 months after Japan's surrender, on the orders of President Truman, who had never been comfortable with Donovan's organization and who had received reports from J. Edgar Hoover and others who had territorial reasons for wanting the OSS eliminated. The dissolution was the specific kind of institutional miscalculation that becomes obvious only in retrospect, because the Cold War that began within months of the OSS's dissolution produced exactly the intelligence requirements that the OSS had been built to meet, and the Central Intelligence Agency that was established in 1947 was built on the institutional foundation, the personnel, the doctrine, and the accumulated experience that the OSS had established. Donovan did not run the CIA. He was never offered the position that his creation of the OSS and his subsequent advocacy for American intelligence capability had logically positioned him for, partly because of the political opposition that his personality and his methods had generated in Washington, and partly because the specific moment of the OSS's dissolution and the CIA's creation did not place Donovan where the institutional momentum of his ideas had seemed to be carrying him. He returned to his law practice. He continued his public involvement. He died in 1959 at the age of 76, having built the American Intelligence Service and not having been offered the opportunity to lead the permanent institution that his temporary organization had made possible. President Eisenhower attended his funeral and said at the graveside that Donovan was the last hero. He may have been right about that. Donovan was a man whose specific combination of qualities, the Medal of Honor courage and the Ivy League intellect and the lawyer's analytical rigor and the willingness to operate in the moral ambiguity that intelligence work requires, was not precisely replicated by anyone who followed him. The CIA that his OSS made possible has operated for nearly 80 years, through the Cold War and through the War on Terror and through all the specific intelligence challenges that the 20th and 21st centuries have produced. It has had its successes and its failures, its moments of extraordinary effectiveness and its moments of catastrophic error. But it exists because Wild Bill Donovan walked into the Oval Office in July 1941 and told Roosevelt what Roosevelt needed to hear. America had no intelligence service. It was going to need one. He built it.